check. I'm ready whenever you are, Brian. Are you good? קח הכל, אני נותן לך הכל. קח הכל, אני מחזיר לך את חיי ואת נפשי. קח הכל. קח הכל, אני נותן לך הכל. קח הכל, אני מחזיר לך את חיי ואת נפשי. קח הכל. אין לי מה לתת, אין לי מה לתת, אין לי מה לתת חוץ מהכל, כי אין לי מה לתת ואף פעם לא היה. אין לי מה לתת, אין לי מה לתת חוץ מהכל. קח הכל, אני נותן לך הכל. קח הכל, אני מחזיר לך את חיי ואת נפשי. קח הכל, כי אתה כל מה שיש בי, ובך כל מה שאני צריך, כי אתה כל מה שיש בי, אז קח הכל. קח הכל, אני נותן לך הכל. קח הכל, אני מחזיר לך את חיי ואת נפשי. קח הכל. The Lord be with you. It is good to be in the house of the Lord today. We are all sorts of spread out. Ooh, I'm going to move my podium here. I think I'm a little too close to the speaker. There we go. Good to be in the house of the Lord this morning. We are a little spread out and a little different. We had the reception here for Jean's recital just, wow, that is so loud. On Friday evening, so I think they had spread out all the tables and done a thing. So if you feel like you're a million miles away, I don't bite, so feel free to move up. We have got a lot of things to cover this morning, starting with this song. I discovered this group. They're called, the main leader of the band is called Shiloh Ben Chod. And he's a Christian, and he writes contemporary worship music in Hebrew. I think he would consider himself a Messianic Jew, which means a very different thing in the States versus in Israel, right? It's a lot easier to be a Messianic Jew in Israel than in America. But this is one of his songs. I have a few of his albums and have really, really enjoyed getting to be acquainted with the music over the last few months. So this is our final week, I don't know how we got here, but we did, of Taste of Hebrew. I hope you have, rather than feeling overwhelmed and like you don't want any more Hebrew, I hope that this has whet your appetite for more. I have a handout I'm going to pass out later if you want more. Several of the books that I've talked about or referenced, or some I even haven't, are out there on the tables. There are other resources and a page that we'll pass out a little later. First, at the very end of last class, we talked about Psalm 23. And what I love about that's why. I was wondering, Leanne, I was still saying some books are on a chair, and they're right here. They're just on the other side of the room. So I want to talk about Robert Alter for a moment. He is a Hebraist. He is a Hebrew scholar of the greatest caliber. And he has actually written several books, but also translated the entire Old Testament from the standpoint of poetry and narrative, really trying to help to convey everything that we lose in English, most English translations. He's trying to regain that. And what can't be regained, he has all sorts of footnotes about. So if you I'll show you the actual translation here in a second, but if you can see this page, this is the translation, and these are the footnotes, right? So about half of this 3-volume set are footnotes, but they are helpful. And so to get us in and kind of connected to last week, I want to go to Psalm 23, and this is from his translation. He starts by saying a David psalm, not a psalm of David, but a David psalm. There's some ambiguity in the Hebrew. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. In grass meadows he makes me lie down. By quiet waters guides me. My life he brings back. He leads me on pathways of justice for his name's sake. Though I walk in the vale of death's shadow, I fear no harm, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, it is they that console me. You set out a table before me in the face of my foes. You moisten my head with oil, my cup overflows. Let but goodness and kindness pursue me all the days of my life, and I shall dwell in the house of the Lord for many long days. So just to give you an idea of one little section here of his footnotes, he says, for many long days, he writes, this concluding phrase catches up the reference to all the days of my life in the preceding line, but it does not mean forever. The viewpoint of the poem is in and of the here and the now, and is no way to be understood as eschatological, meaning of the end days, end times. The speaker hopes for a happy fate of all his born days and prays the good fortune to abide in the Lord's sanctuary, a place of security and harmony with the divine all, or perhaps at least most of those days. So, if you are looking to go deeper in Hebrew, or at least in the Hebrew Bible, I really recommend this translation, this set. I find them very helpful. Whenever you're reading and you're like, I don't know what's going on here. I know this is translated, but I need this translation translated. I don't understand it still. Robert Alter's really good at figuring it out. Yeah, go ahead, Nancy. Mm-hmm.
When they have the 23rd Psalm,
yeah,
it's
Yeah, that's a...
So it would probably sound different to us?
Sure, certainly so. So within Jewish traditions, they do not use the King James or the New Revised Standard. There are accepted and the standard Jewish translations, including the JPS, the Jewish Publication Society version, and the NJPS, which I believe came out in the 90s. There is, if you want, there's a Jewish study Bible, which has more of the text that you'd be reading in synagogue, as well as, I don't know who, I think it is also the Jewish Publication Society that comes out with a Tanakh in English, blue cover. I'd have to look up all the information if that's the one you're interested in. But yeah, there has been a divide from the earliest of times, from the beginning of the Christian era, that Christians really liked the Greek. This is going off on a tangent for a moment, but I think it's okay. That Christians had their own interpretation of the Greek text, the Septuagint of the Old Testament, because the earliest Christians, of course, knew Hebrew, but then within a couple decades, that knowledge really waned. And the early church mostly spoke Greek, and so the Septuagint really became the Christian translation. Even though it was done pre-Christianity, it became interpreted through such a Christian lens that the Jews said, this is not our translation, we need our own. Or we need to go back to Hebrew, which didn't last long. But good question. Yeah, there are many more translations, and you will find there are some Jewish communities that have used the King James version of the Psalm 23 because it is so standard. So I want to start off just a very quick review of kind of where we have been, and then we'll go some new places today. So we started off by talking about how the Hebrew alphabet and our own alphabet came to be established. And we talked about the one word. If you remember any single word from this class, I hope it is or any simple idea. The word is acrophonic, meaning that the way the alphabet or aleph-bet was conceived of is they had, instead of drawing thousands of little pictures of exactly what you were talking about, some genius came up with the idea of, let's take very common words, and the very first sound of that word, we'll use that sound and we'll draw just that one picture. So about 22 images, and for water, they said, well, that word is, and this is in our language, or our letters, of course, this is mayim. So let's take the symbol for water and we'll give it an M sound. So it started off, let's see, where is it here? It started off just like a little waveform, and then it kind of evolved, it got a little longer, and then it kind of grew even more, and we have this shape for our letter M because the Hebrew, the Phoenician, the Canaanite words for water all started with the M sound, right? From there, we talked about how Hebrew in the modern era, well, in about 800 to 1,000 of the Christian era, vowel points were added to the Hebrew text, the consonantal text. But most Hebrew today and ancient Hebrew did not have any sense of vowels. So it's just like reading, today I had a rotten day. As I was coming in from play, I accidentally stubbed my toes. You kind of get the idea, right? We also talked about the evolution of Hebrew from the biblical stages, of which there were various, right? There were some of the oldest stages of biblical Hebrew. It's really captured in some old songs, like the Song of the Sea in Exodus 15. They used older, archaic language, whereas there were even later versions of the biblical Hebrew where they didn't use those archaicisms. Instead, they used more modern words, even more modern grammar. And then after Christ, the rabbis really took over Hebrew. It was really heavily influenced by Aramaic, but then Hebrew mostly went extinct. And today, we'll talk about, for a little bit, we'll talk about this guy, Eliezer ben Yehuda, and how he brought Hebrew back. the only language that I know of that has been brought back practically from the dead and now has millions of native speakers. Then zooming through these, this comes from Matthew Schlimm's book. If it's out there, hold it up. I think it's right there, Beth, if you could just wait. Oh, that one. Oh, your own copy. Look at that. These are some fabulous charts. I really recommend this book, 70 Words That Every Christian Should Know. He goes through some of what's lost in translation. So if one Hebrew word has a particular meaning and a sound, when we translate it, it might lose its sound. So Adam, Adamah, right? The meaning of these is earth, but the sound connection is sometimes lost, right? Earthling, mudman. We talked about humus versus human. Those connections, it's not good English, right? It's hard to read Genesis if it were translated like that. So some things get lost. Similarly, we have a meaning that's lost, but the sound. The name of one of Adam and Eve's children, Abel, we just know Abel, but we don't know what it means. We know the sound. Well, Hevel means fleeting breath. So from the very time that Abel is named, you might have a clue, that's not a name you want to be named. That's something's going to happen here. Similarly, in Hebrew, you sometimes have a word with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 meanings, and when it's translated into English, you kind of have to pick one. And so that the multiple level, the polysemy, is lost. So the one word we talked about appears in Genesis 2, where, and it's all throughout Scripture, but the word is avad. When Adam is told to avad the ground, or vad and shomer, is he to keep and watch? Is he to till? Is he to work? Is he to worship? Because avad means all of those things. So what exactly do we do with that? And then we talked about how sometimes translations have a current word then, but it's an outdated word now, or sometimes there's that disconnect. And in English, we talked about the word deliver, right? If you ask most kids today, what does the word deliver mean? And you don't say, in church, what does it mean? They'll be like, like Amazon delivers a package. Well, if that's what children are thinking about the first time they hear deliver and they say, Jesus delivers you, they're going to be like, why would Jesus pick me up and carry me on a van to someone else's house? I don't get it, right? I don't think we're far away. I think within my ministry, we'll probably not be able to use the word deliver anymore. Just like we'll probably have to focus more on save or liberate or rescue, other words that are more current and understandable because the younger generation doesn't use deliver in the same way. Also, we talked about Cheech and Chong, if you remember, right? When Paul says, I was stoned, he doesn't mean he was stoned. And then, of course, there, as we talked about, sometimes you have a word, and you could just translate it dictionary to dictionary, and that's fine, but there are broader connotations as if it's a biblical association to modern association. It's not always the same. So horses was the example we talked about. Horses were outlawed in ancient Israel. Why? Because they were seen as they were the quintessence of military might. And so they were like a tank. We also talked about how verbs work. Often they have 3 letters, and then you can take this and make all sorts of words with it. We had this crazy chart. We looked at the word the shoresh, the roots of katav, which is to write, and how in Hebrew you use those same letters, but tack a few extra letters on the front or at the end, and you get all sorts of other words: dictation, correspondence, reporter, writing, dictate, pulp, writer, I don't know, written subtitles, all these overlapping ideas that in English we have very different words for. In Hebrew, if you look at it, you can say, I don't know what that is, but it has something to do with writing. We are not going to do this right now. We also did you felt like you were back in ninth grade Spanish class, right? We did some conversations with our neighbor. And that is kind of where we have been. Now, I want to take some time and move into some material we didn't quite get to, still talking about biblical Hebrew, before we move on to modern Hebrew and kind of its effects in the world. So, one idea is called gematria. I've talked about this before. Christians rarely do anything with gematria, but there's only a few places it crops up in the New Testament, but it's good to be aware of. Gematria, we talked about the Bible code, right? From the 90s, there was that whole craze. I read the first book and then quickly threw it in the trash. But it's an interesting book, but it's more conspiracy theories than anything else. But an age-old tradition within Judaism is gematria, and it is still strange from a Christian perspective and point of view because this is not something we do. Most of it for me rings a little weird and hollow. I don't quite know what to do with it. But the system, just so you're aware, you take every letter and it has a numeric value. And then you can take words comprised of these letters, add them up, and get a certain number. And that might tell you something because another word has the same value. Or if you add up a certain set of words, they might have a sum, and that sum might have a certain meaning. It sounds strange to us, again, because it's not something we do. But if you know the number 666 from Revelation, that's probably an example of gematria. Most biblical scholars would say so. And you take the words for Nero Caesar, and you add it up. And guess what? Every single letter there adds up to 666. So it's a code. If you have the mark of the beast is not truly like someone drawing 666 on your forehead or your hand. It's instead contrasted with the mark of the lamb. And it's saying, who do you pledge your loyalty to? To God or Caesar? But as John is writing this, he is likely concerned that this might never get out there. And so he has to speak in coded language, because if he doesn't, it might not get there. So this is one of the codes he uses. Also the word, and we started talking about this last week, the word, because we sang the Shechecheyanu, which has the word chai in it, and chai is the word for life. It's like l'chaim, which I don't know if there's any Fiddler on the Roof fans here, but we regularly sing to life, l'chaim at home. And it has the numeric value, when you add it up, it is 8 and 10. So if you have 8 plus 10 equals 18, if you aren't ever invited to go to a bar mitzvah or a Jewish wedding or any special event and you are going to be giving some money, it's a good idea to not just give them $20, give them 18 or multiples thereof, because that is a way of saying, I hope you have a good life, right? So that's still something in the modern era where this comes to the fore. There's also here, this is the genealogy of Matthew. And I don't know about you, but it's a little strange. It's 14, it's 14, it's 14. But scholars are like, there's more than 14 there. We know about other people in between. What is Matthew up to? We recognize certain people here, but what happens is 14 is also the name of David in gematria. So is Matthew trying to say Jesus is descended from David, right? Is that what's going on here? That's gematria. So here's myth number 6. We should uncritically trust all gematria. We should not. It's fascinating, and you can get lost in it, but you shouldn't trust it all. This is a very strange one that comes from the Secrets of Hebrew Words. I think there's more secrets out and around there somewhere, the follow-up. But he has this whole chapter, well, whole page really, devoted to how at the Seder we are told to respond to the wicked son in this way, Hakeh et shinav, which means remove or knock out his teeth, right? Which I'm not at all promoting here. Do not do this. But he says, if you look at the word for wicked, wicked is 570. And then his teeth is 366. So if you take 366 from 570, you get 204. And 204 means righteous. So if you take out the wicked person's teeth, you take out his teeth, he becomes righteous. This is very strange to us, but this is especially an ancient tradition within Judaism. As well, it is something within mystical Judaism that is still well known and practiced. This is kind of the more extreme example of it, but there are others that, like the Chai, right? Chai is 18. We don't question it, it's just a thing. And, like this one, David, David, David. That makes sense to us. But then you get this, and it's like, I don't quite know what's going on there. There's another interesting kind of, oh, yeah, go ahead, Beth.
Does the word for teeth, though, have multiple meanings? So
Oh.
the wicked person's speech
Oh, gosh.
that helps tame their wickedness.
Yeah.
Like, I don't know.
Yeah, the whole practice of gematria is very tenuous because, if something is spelled a little differently, if it were just teeth, instead of his teeth, it would be a different number. If it were her teeth, or it would totally mess the whole thing up. It's very tenuous, and it's similar to the Bible code in that if you're one letter off, the whole thing falls apart. I want to just throw out one other thing. This really only comes up in Jeremiah. So if you're reading the prophet Jeremiah, you should know about the Atbash cipher. This is another code. And it's like in English if you switched A and Z, but instead in Hebrew, it's like you're taking Aleph for Tav, so you have the At, and Bet for Shin, so B, Sh. And in Jeremiah 25:26, you read that the king of Sheshach shall drink after them. Where is Sheshach on a map? Well, let's find out. Sheen, and then Kaf. So, Bet, Lamed, Babel. Anybody recognize that place name? Babel is Babel, right? So Babylon. So Jeremiah again is using coded language to say that the king of Babylon shall drink after them. There are a few other examples in Jeremiah of this Atbash cipher being used. I want to move on now to talk about manuscripts, because this is a question we sometimes get. What are all those manuscripts all about? What do we do with them? Oh, the Dead Sea Scrolls. Oh, there's something mysterious and mystic about what's going on there. So I want to give you a little bit of background on just a few, the most important scrolls or collections of manuscripts. This is right here. I believe this is cave 12. No, this is cave, I think it's cave 4. I don't remember now. This is one of the caves. Let's go there instead, where the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered. Starting in 1945 through 1956, there were a series of these 12 caves discovered. And they had all sorts of scrolls and fragments of scrolls. Some were more important than others, and they were going back centuries and millennia, really, all the way back from the 3rd century before Christ to probably the 1st century of the Common Era. And they represent some of the oldest surviving manuscripts of entire books later included in the canon, and many others. So this, if you notice, this is someone taking a picture from inside there, so this is outside. About 40% are copies from the Hebrew Scriptures, 30% are others that were not canonized, and the remainder, the other 30, are sectarian manuscripts the community rule, the war scroll. So these are about how these people who wrote these and kept these and then stored them here, and then everyone forgot they were there for hundreds and hundreds of years. How they lived together, what they believed. It would kind of be like if we had a closet somewhere, and after 1,000 years, nobody opened it, and they said, "Oh, look at all these session minutes," and that kind of a thing. That's kind of the equivalent, right? That's what they found with the Dead Sea Scrolls. Now, these are extremely important because they represent the oldest examples of some biblical manuscripts. So here you have, this is the Isaiah scroll, which is one of the most important of all of the Dead Sea Scrolls found because it contains almost the entirety of the book of Isaiah. You also have here a fragment. Even the little tiny fragments are still important. This is one. Notice there are no points here. These are just the consonants. And this is, in the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth, right? This is the first few verses of Genesis. So do we wish we had older examples of the Hebrew Bible? Yes. But this is the oldest we've got. And 100 years ago, nobody thought we'd ever find such a thing. So this is incredible. Now, this is the oldest, but before we even knew about this, the most important manuscript, which was called the Aleppo Codex, also known as the Keter, or the Crown, because it's one of the most beautiful. And the Aleppo Codex was written around the 9th century, probably around 920, and it does have all those extra vowel points. And there is a huge story here that it was complete, right? It was before the Dead Sea Scrolls. Well, the Dead Sea Scrolls didn't help, but the Aleppo Codex was the oldest and most complete manuscript we had of the Hebrew Bible canon, the whole thing from 920. What happened just after World War II is that it was separated. It was one whole text, and then parts of it were taken and separated from the rest. We've never discovered the rest of it. It's somewhere out in the world, we hope and pray, and I hope that it's recovered in my lifetime. I think that'd be pretty interesting. But we've only discovered, as I understand it, we've only recovered one page. The rest is still in the wind. So Indiana Jones, let's get him on this case, because I love that, right? Yeah. The next most important manuscript after 47 now that we don't have the Aleppo as a whole manuscript, this is the next best thing we've got. Leningrad Codex, I believe it's, 1008. It was made probably in Cairo. It's called Leningrad because it's housed in what was Leningrad in Russia. And it is the foundation for all the Hebrew Bibles that I had to read in seminary. The Leningrad Codex is kind of the standard. So here is I just love this picture, but this is someone reading with what's called a yod. If you can really see here, this is a little tiny hand. And when you read Torah in the synagogue, you're first of all, you're not supposed to touch the scroll itself, right? Because a single scroll can be upwards of $100,000. Because sometimes these can take years of a sofer's life, a scribe's life, to literally write moment by moment. There are certain prayers that have to be said before you start, when you're done. And heaven forbid you make a mistake and have to start over, right? It's a whole big thing. So it takes a long time. So you don't touch the scroll. Instead, you use a little hand pointer to show where you're going. But if I'm preparing for a bar mitzvah or bat mitzvah, you probably aren't going to be able to read this if you're 12 or 13, right? It's not easy to do. So you may learn it in another book and then memorize it, and then kind of follow along here. And And as I understand it, most people who have bar mitzvah, bat mitzvahs, they memorize their passage, and then they can pretty much tell you their passage for the rest of their life. It's kind of an inside secret, right? So, what was your passage? Called the parasha. What was your parasha for your bar mitzvah? That's kind of like that inside little secret. And I'll point out again to say that the text with vowels is not considered holy. The vowels are not holy, it's just the consonants. The vowels we know were added much later, so that's why these zillion-dollar scrolls do not have the vowels, because they are not part of the original text. Okay. We move on now to modern Hebrew. So I remember in seminary, well before I knew anything about modern Hebrew, I had a guy a few years ahead of me, and he told me that modern Hebrew and biblical Hebrew were exactly the same. I thought, okay, good, sounds good enough to me. I don't really know anything about modern Hebrew. So this was a myth that I believed for many years until I actually started looking at modern Hebrew and said, how do they have a word for computer? Because they didn't have computers way back in Bible times. So Ivrit modernit, modern Hebrew, is not Ivrit, Mikra'it. Biblical Hebrew is not Ivrit Chadasha, new or modern Hebrew. So we're going to watch a few clips of a longer film short about the father of biblical Hebrew, or modern Hebrew, excuse me. Before we watch these, let me say that in the transition from biblical to modern Hebrew, there were just plain not enough words. Biblical Hebrew has only about 8,000 words, and the language of the Bible we've talked about does not cover every single conversation or topic of discussion. So if you want to have a discussion about electrical engineering, or you're trying to flirt with someone at the bar, biblical Hebrew is not going to get you very far, right? You've got to have more words. So also we know that words are always changing. Pronunciation is changing. I think of, how do we pronounce the word D-A-T-A? Data or data? Do we know the story here? Do we have any Next Generation fans? Star Trek Next Generation has shifted our pronunciation of the word D-A-T-A from data to data, because Data, the character on Next Generation, we hear that word a lot more on that show than anywhere else. And so we are seeing this shift with one single word over just a couple decades. Data? Nope, data. They're both accepted, they're both right, but one is, if in 1980, if you said data, people would be like, what's wrong with you? Now today, you can say either. And also, particular words that aren't really useful from biblical Hebrew have different meanings. So in biblical Hebrew, the word nasi meant prince. Modern Israel doesn't have a monarchy, so they use that same word nasi, and that's used for president. In biblical Hebrew, there's an Assyrian word shoter, which meant like a scribe or an officer working in the court. They don't have that in modern Israel. Now the word shoter means policeman. So they've taken these older words and given them new meanings. So with all those things in mind, we're turning now to just this short clip, two short clips. And this is Eliezer ben Yehuda, the father of modern Hebrew, especially in relation to his son, Itamar. And Eliezer ben Yehuda was so devoted to the idea of modern Hebrew being rebirthed that when he started his family, he told his wife, Deborah, we're not speaking anything to him except Hebrew. Meanwhile, Eliezer is creating Hebrew. He has to still come up with words, right? So this is not a complete language. He's still figuring it out. And his son, for many years, did not speak at all. And the story, which is not here, I wasn't even planning on telling, but the story goes that his son was probably 3 or 4 before he started speaking at all. And he told, I think it was that he told the nanny or whoever you have to speak in Hebrew. And Eliezer found her singing in her native language to the child, and he got upset, and he was yelling. And the boy, for the first time, grabbed him and said, Abba. And his first word was daddy, like, stop it. Like, and so it's a crazy, weird situation, but an interesting one. So this is the first clip.
וגלידה.
גלידה?
כן, כי היא עשויה מגלידים של קרח.
גלידה.
רק לספר המילים עדיין אינני מוצא שם. יש בו כבר 5,000 מילים בעברית, כולן מסודרות לפי האלף בית, אבל... יום יבוא, ולכל בית יהודי יהיה את הספר הזה.
מה דעתך על מילון?
מילון?
אלו מילים רבות. המיעוט גדול באלון.
מילה? מילון? יפה, בן ציון.
So he doesn't talk to the other children. That's why they're calling him mute.
¿Es mudo de verdad? No sé, él nunca habla.
And they're all speaking Spanish, if you can't pick that up.
שלום רבותיי.
Buenos días, Eliezer. ¿Estás al corriente de las nuevas gezerot que los turcos imposaron por tu culpa?
אם לא תדברו עברית, לא אשוחח איתכם.
Un momento. ¿Me permites que le hable yo?
¿Hablar en lashon?
No tenemos otra opción. La comunidad está en peligro. הם יסירו את הגזרות רק אם תחדל מפרסומך.
לא כתבתי דבר נגד הטורקים.
הם מצאו במאמר שלך על מרד המכבים שיפעל למרד דומה נגדם. אם לא תחדל מהוצאת כתב העת שלך, משפחתך תוחרם.
אמור עיתון, לא כתב עת.
עקשנותך לא תיטיב עמך.
בן ציון,
אבל הם איימו עליך.
ולמרות זאת,
So you get the idea from those two short clips that there's some tension going on. It's not as if Eliezer ben Yehuda came on the scene and said, we're going to restart the Hebrew language here, and everyone was on board. In fact, what was really strange is that there, from our modern day perspective, is that there was a lot of pushback. When Eliezer arrived in Jerusalem around 1880 or so, no one spoke Hebrew. Not a person, no one in their daily life. His neighbors spoke Arabic, Spanish, Turkish, Yiddish, Ladino, which we'll talk about in another moment. And many thought that speaking Hebrew was forbidden and even an affront to the state, the Ottoman Empire. But Eliezer sought to change that. He took the 8,000 words from the Hebrew Bible, plus we talked about the evolution of Hebrew. In the rabbinic period, there were many more words, around 20,000 or so, that weren't in biblical Hebrew. And he took all of those and he put them together. And then he added all sorts of other words from sister languages like Arabic and from Yiddish, and also others that had no relation, like English. We already talked about his son. Yep. And during his lifetime, many Hebrew schools were opened. So can you imagine at the beginning of his lifetime, nobody spoke Hebrew as a native language. But within his lifetime before he died, he had done so much in the growing, not yet, nation of Israel, that there were 55 schools established with Hebrew as their main language of instruction. So in a very short time, a lot happened. This comes from how the Hebrew language grew. It's somewhere out there. I think it's in front of you. No, that's not the one. It's somewhere out there. I don't know. But I just thought this was an interesting thing. There were all sorts of words in both biblical Hebrew, and we've talked about a few of these already, but biblical Hebrew as well as rabbinic Hebrew that didn't really have, we weren't sure what they were, or they didn't have any modern equivalents. And so they became new words, new concepts. So pisanter, some sort of a musical instrument, that's as much as we know. This word appears in the Psalms. Well, we have this word, we have this instrument here in 1880, and we're like, we don't know what to call it. It didn't exist in biblical times or rabbinic times. What do we call it? Well, we have this word for a musical instrument. No one knows what it is, so let's use that word and call this that. So there's some distinction. Also, Ben Yehuda, we're not going to go through all of these, but he created new words like glida, ice cream. He took from the Arabic jalid, or towel. It comes from the word to be dry. Bicycle means two wheels, right? Just like instead of bicycle, right, with 2 feet or whatever. I don't know. And he also tried to coin certain words that didn't take, right? He tried to call this a talk far, like you can talk far away, which is what telephone really means originally, right? But nobody liked it, so it didn't stick. There's more. There's this interesting, this is where my geek completely comes out, and this is one of my favorite little resources, a comprehensive etymological dictionary of the Hebrew language for readers of English. It's a good one. In the last, I want to give some time for questions, so I'm going to zoom through this next part. But some of you have said, well, what's Yiddish all about? And all these other languages too. How do these relate to Hebrew? I want to just show you here, if you notice, this is a newsstand, and there's some Hebrew books, but there's also some Yiddish words here as well. Yiddish is a language that originated in Germany about the 9th century. It was a mix of German and Hebrew, Aramaic, and it was all first spoken by the Ashkenazim. So have you heard of Ashkenazi or Sephardic? Right? These are the two major groups of Jewish people throughout Middle East and Europe. Yiddish was spoken by the Ashkenazim primarily, and you can start to imagine, even if Hebrew wasn't spoken on a daily basis as an everyday language, there are certain words that were part of their everyday speaking. So we have Christianese, right? So if I tell you to go to the narthex, what are you going to do? Are you going to look at me like, where? Where would you go? I see some fingers, right? You're going to go to the sanctuary, and you're going to go to the back, and that's the narthex, right? That's a very strange word. And if you had a person who'd never stepped in a church and you said, oh, meet me in the narthex, they'd probably be like, what? They wouldn't get it. We have certain words here in the church that we just assume everyone knows, but they don't, right? Paraments and stoles and chancel, and we don't say altar, we say table, right? All those sorts of things, that's kind of our own method of speaking. Similarly, in Jewish communities, even if you're not speaking Hebrew on the daily, in the synagogue, you have certain words and phrases. You'd say, I'm going to go to shul. That means like religious school. And all those words kind of became incorporated into Yiddish. Similarly, the Sephardic people, Sepharad means Spain, They, especially following but also especially following the expulsion of the Jews in 1492 from Spain, there was this very isolated, close-knit group of people, and they spoke Spanish with a little added extra of Hebrew, Aramaic, Arabic, and that's called Ladino or Judeo-Espanol. There are others. There's many others. I have not heard of this one. Bukhari is a combination of Hebrew and Tajik. I believe it's spoken in Tajikistan, Iran area today. And then Judeo-Arabic, which is not, as I understand it, at all spoken anymore, but is important historically. It is as if you took the Hebrew language and put it in Arabic letters. And then, of course, as you do that, more Arabic words get put into the language. It's important because during the golden age of Islam, lots of folks spoke Judeo-Arabic. And a very famous book, Maimonides' Guide of the Perplexed, was written not in Hebrew, not in Spanish, but in Judeo-Arabic. So I want to give you an idea here. Ashkenaz, remember Ashkenaz is just the word for about the equivalent of Germany. And those folks are from Eastern Europe. So this is the Ashkenazi area. The Sephardic people, Sepharad meaning Spain, came from here. And they kind of went everywhere. But during 1492, they came through to the Balkans as well as to Turkey. So we sometimes lose the connection because Sephardic peoples are over here, but they come from Spain. And they also come into here. And then there's other groups here. There's Mizrahi. There's other major groups, but these are the primary ones. In the last few moments we have before I start taking questions, I want to show you this because I think this is neat. This is this is all saying the same thing. This is English. This is this in just transliterated, but it's El Judeo Español es la lengua fablada de los judíos sefardim arrojados de la Hispania en el 1492. I'm not sure how to actually say that in Ladino, but you see that the same language here can be written in Hebrew letters and Roman Latin letters. And this is one example of Ladino. I bring this because I can understand most of this, being a Spanish speaker. If it were Yiddish, I couldn't do it. So I wanted to clue you into a few more things, and then I'll take some questions. This coming Friday, we are welcoming everyone from this class, from Pastor Dave and Courtney's classes on the Old Testament, as well as those going to Israel. Anyone who wants to come is invited to Temple Israel this coming Friday. The service is at 6:15, and there is, prior to that, at 5:30, there's some fellowship and refreshments. This is an opportunity to put all that you've learned into practice, and you might feel, instead of coming in cold and not knowing, where is the narthex? What language are you speaking? You have a little bit of foundation to kind of know a little bit more about what's going on. So you're invited to come to this. And then next Sunday, for 3 weeks, a very short little class, but Jay Case got some questions during our African American biographies class about historically black colleges and universities, HBCUs. And so he started looking into this and said, I think there's a class here. There is a class here. I want to teach it. So he's come up with this. So while many of those are in Israel, Dr. Case will be here teaching on this class. Okay. So I see, oh, yes, thank you. Beth is going to go around. There is a handout with some resources. I think almost all of these have been discussed in the class already. And some of these are literally copied and pasted from various slides. But if you didn't get a chance to capture it, if you missed a week, there's some big stuff you may have missed. If you want any other resources, If you want some bands to listen to in Hebrew or anything like that, let me know. Thank you, Beth. Yeah, go ahead, Fred.
Yes,
It's on.
okay. You were talking about the Septuagint,
Oh, yes.
Greek.
Mm-hmm.
The Old Testament was in Hebrew.
Yep.
When it was translated to Greek,
Right?
was the Hebrew corrupted? In other words, translation and translation, did things get corrupted or confused? I always have the question, if the Old Testament's in Hebrew, to understand it, should we really study it in Hebrew?
So that's a really great question. There is some debate on this, and depending on who you are, where you are, your answers might differ. The question is about the Old Testament. We know was written in Hebrew and a little bit of Aramaic, right? 240 odd verses. But then it was translated into the Septuagint, and that Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible is what the early church read. Also, remember we talked about the Leningrad Codex, the Aleppo Codex, and then the Dead Sea Scrolls. We have some fragments. We don't have a complete Bible of around the same time as the Septuagint was translated. So some biblical scholars would argue that the Septuagint actually gives us access to some older text, an older Hebrew version of the Bible than we have. That being said, we don't have it in Hebrew, we have it in Greek. So we have to back translate to try to figure out what was the original text saying. So there is some difficulty there for text criticism's sake of what was the oldest text, which becomes very difficult in books like Job, I believe, where the Septuagint is about 30% different than the Masoretic text of the Hebrew. So we don't quite know what to do with all of that. But translations, I wouldn't say that the translations were corrupted. But if you understand, we didn't have Xerox machines 2,000, 3,000 years ago. So every time a manuscript is copied by hand, there's bound to be some missteps, right? A wrong stroke of the pen, or just even a single millimeter of difference can make, right? There's two different, this and this, those are two different letters, right? And those are often miswritten. And so some sloppy manuscripts, you might not know what letter you're looking at. That's a resh or a dalet. Is it a D or an R? So I wouldn't say that there was corruption in translation, but manuscripts can have some errors over the centuries, and those sometimes get codified and copied and copied and copied. That is not to say that there were translation errors. There's not to say that there's huge corruption. Again, scholars have done lots of work on this and say we now in 2023 have a better understanding of what the original Hebrew text said than we did 100 years ago. And again, none of this is dependent on, these little things where we question and talk about, and Robert Alter loves to talk. None of this is changing our salvation. Who God is, how God loves us. No, those things are not in question. But like, what was Noah's ark made out of? We don't know. Does it matter? Not really. It's not going to change my life, right, to know that it was cypress wood or some other kind of wood. But those are still question marks. Good question, Fred. Another question over here from Kent.
With the adoption of the Hebrew language, with the pushback that there was, why would they bother to do that? What was the driving
What was the pushback?
force for people to really take it over? Did they feel more righteous if they did that, or did the rabbis think it should be done? Or
So why were they trying to resurrect the Hebrew language? Why did it work? I think people did it because they were understanding that Hebrew was a language of all their own, right? There are dozens of language groups and peoples from all over in the diaspora, and as they're coming back to Israel and saying, we want to have a nation again, we need something to unify us. So Hebrew became that unifying force. But initially, there were communities that said, no, we haven't spoken this language for hundreds of years. God must have there must be a reason for it. And so we've got to shut it down. We can't speak Hebrew anymore. So they really held on to their older languages like Yiddish. And which is why you still have, even today in New York City, is Jamestown, Courtney? Williamsburg. No, what's the community where The Chosen was set? Williamsburg in New York City has a huge population of Yiddish speakers, and they can trace their history back to that time period where Yiddish was still predominantly spoken and Hebrew had not yet come in. So interesting there. But yeah, go ahead, Dan.
Michael, it's always a challenge to me to keep up with all the Jewish festivals.
Oh, yes.
Based on a calendar which I have never been able to figure out. Can you simplify the Jewish calendar, or is that another day? And you can certainly put
that sounds like a whole series, Dan. I love that idea.
I would love to spend some time with the Jewish calendar and the festivals.
Okay. That sounds like a whole class unto itself. But very broadly, yeah, time is measured differently within the Hebrew Jewish calendar. They don't start a day at midnight and ends at 11:59. Instead, it's shifted so that sunset begins a new day. And they're also lunar-based calendar, different months, different years, all those sorts of things. Yeah, you know what? Let's do a class. That sounds good. That sounds great. Debbie, last question. Go for it. No, I want to hear it. Let's go.
The Torah, okay, so
Yes.
the Torah was not originally a Torah. They were all written on separate papers.
It was a scroll, one long scroll.
Separate pieces of paper on there, so it appeared to look like that, but.
This is a scroll. So this is they take certain pages and they have to kind of glue them together, but this is one long scroll. And the oldest text would have been written on these scrolls, not in codices like books. Oh, when Spitzer brought yeah, that was cool. Oh, wasn't that cool? Yeah, he rolled the whole thing out. Yeah. Very good. I hope to see you this coming Friday at Temple Israel. And we have more songs we could be singing, but we're not going to. There's always more to learn. I look forward to it in a future time. The Lord be with you.